limestone hill, where God's voice bounced off the ceiling, and the air stood still. The congregation gathered where no daylight came, and they sang in the absolute dark. Called his name, Lord, they called his name. The Reverend Boone found the cavern in the 1880s deep in the limestone hill behind his house, where the cold spring sea. He said the Lord spoke to him in the dark of the cave and told him this was the place to build the kingdom of the saved. They carried in the pine plank pews and the lanterns one by one, and the congregation grew to 80 by that summer's done. The county thought the cave church was a strange and foolish thing, but the cave church kept its doors open and kept its congregation singing. Reverend Boone said God preferred the underground to sky, because the earth receives us all, and the earth don't wonder why. He baptized in the cold spring that ran along the cave's far wall. He said the cold was grace, and the dark was the great hall. They buried him inside the cave in 1923. The congregation sealed his grave with limestone from the seam, and some say they still meet in there on the quarterly feast. Someone dressed as Boone presiding over each service at least. They worshipped in the cave church in the limestone hill, where God's voice bounced off the ceiling, and the air stood still. The congregation gathered where no daylight came, and they sang in the absolute dark, and they called his name. They called his name, Lord, they called his name. I went inside on a dare when I was barely grown. I had a kerosene lantern and a heart of limestone stone. But when the light played on the ceiling of that deep and ancient room, I felt something older than my doubting in the gloom. I can't say if it was God or just the weight of all that rock above a hollow space that had been hollow since the clock of continents began. began, but I came out different than I went. And the cave church in the limestone hill is where my reason bent. They worshipped in the cave church in the limestone hill, where God's voice bounced off the ceiling and the air stood still. The congregation gathered where no daylight came, and they sang in the absolute dark, and they called his name. They called his name, Lord. They called his name.